So, Remy, what do you think? Shall we go?
Sounds good.
Good. Once again, thank you everyone for joining. So this is the second webinar we host on topic of BACS actually. This time not on a specific region, but on like what's behind it, where does the legislation come from, and what's the commonalities between those countries. So what do energy teams in the end have to do when managing portfolios across borders? That's the topic of today. Before I introduce myself further, maybe Remy, a good time for you to introduce yourselves.
Sure. So hello everyone, and thanks a lot for the invitation, Joachim.
Our pleasure.
I'm Remy Colombian, Secretary General at Efficient Buildings Europe. So we're the European Trade Association representing companies that deliver products and equipment for energy efficiency in buildings. Our role is basically to be the voice of the sector and interact with EU decision makers on any type of legislation that focuses on energy, climate, public procurement, financing, all that focused on energy efficiency in buildings. So we really have a holistic perspective to buildings performance.
To add to that in a way, I think Remy is one of the best placed people in Europe to have an overview of all the different types of legislation that are moving and what's happening behind them. So there are few people that have or like so to that extent in the driver's seat is maybe a wrong word, but have a cockpit view on everything. So that being said, so I'm Joachim, for those that don't know, one of the co-founders of NRC, and we're an AI virtual energy management company. So a software company focusing on how we can improve energy performance across asset portfolios, including a lot of buildings. But I don't want to expand too much on NRC itself. Let's dive into the topic. So we have a couple of sections today. We're going to do it. There are some slides, but the goal is really to have a conversation about this. And so we'll be asking some questions back and forth and presenting a thing here and there, some information. Please ask some questions in either the chat, if it's questions you want to answer between you, or in the Q&A. In the Q&A questions we might address during the webinar, or we have a little bit of time near the end that we dive specifically in those. So please feel free to ask questions there, whatever it is that you would like to ask. So we'll jump into the basics first, like what is it about? How does it place into the regulatory framework? And then the navigating it across Europe, especially for multinational organizations. I guess this is interesting. And then compliance and a very short section about like how can NRC play a role, or players like NRC play a role? How to be compliant without expensive upgrades everywhere, in its essence. Good, let's go. Let's go into the first one. So what exactly is BACS and how does it relate to the other ones? Maybe here, Remy, what's like for you, what are the main like macro drivers, especially on
Sure.
the legislation perspective?
So first, I'll zoom out, and basically there's a few macro trends that we see in Europe and that are driving the regulation on energy efficiency in general in buildings. And I mean, the first one is obviously energy costs. We've seen in 2022 with the energy price crisis that our dependence on external suppliers and our high consumption and very inefficient buildings in Europe are a liability, and that had very negative effects. But it's having lasting effects, and that's one of the points that's pushing decision makers now that the sort of zeitgeist in Europe is a bit around security and competitiveness versus the US versus China, to really put in place measures that would incentivize and requires both companies, but building owners at large, let's say, to take measures to make sure that they use energy in the most efficient way possible. We're also seeing that both people and businesses are understanding the information tools that have been developed over the sort of previous versions of the legislation, and that now energy performance certificates are better understood. And since this year's around the energy crisis, it's starting to have a real world impact on first property prices. And so I was talking to people in the ministries in the Netherlands and in Germany, for example, over the past few days, and they're saying now that they're observing plus 25% in value for properties level A compared to the average D, and minus 25% for the worst performing buildings. And we see the same to a small extent, but for rents, where there's a clear demand for buildings that are performing better, because people know that the bills are going to be lower and it's going to be nicer to work in, to live in.
Oh.
And I mean, maybe the last point in there, we understand a bit better now the role of indoor environmental quality. That's been really driven by the sort of COVID years, where people started to live a bit more indoors for a few years. And there's research that's come out saying that clearly good indoor environmental quality is absolutely essential for health, and it really boosts productivity.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say? The first one you said is pretty interesting, I think, because like it used to be about sustainability, which is hopefully still an important component, of course, but it seems like it has moved a lot from, hey, actually, we need just to use our energy more efficiently whilst upping production, but just to be less dependent of certain other parts of the world at the moment. Like, to what extent is that really an important driver on the European playing field at the moment?
I mean, it's very impressive to see how the narratives have changed since the previous mandate, and now it's all about competitiveness. I mean, since the election, and now I'm impressed also by international events. We're really seeing that competitiveness together with security is sort of two sides of the same coin in the energy world, are really driving the decisions. And now anything that's really discussed around energy efficiency is done on the basis of, is it something that will drive competitiveness of European companies for large buildings?
Yeah, cool. Cool. Interesting for sure to see how things are moving in that sense. Or briefly on BACS itself. So, like, what is it like from the European perspective? We'll see how it fits into all of the different legislation, because there's a lot of different things moving at the same time. But you want to quickly
Sure.
explain this one?
So happy to jump in there. I mean, it's like everything at EU level, it stays sort of at the broad level, and it's precise at the national level. But there, I mean, BACS in general, we're seeing that it's really considered as the brain or nervous system of the buildings. It can range from the sort of self-regulating valve to much more advanced building management system. And we're seeing this taking more and more importance in EU legislation, where there's this vision of future buildings that will be the sort of nodes of the energy system, and a real empowerment of building occupants, building owners to really understand better how they consume energy and what they can do to improve quality of life, work in there, but also to save money at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Maybe just we could talk a lot more on that, but being cautious of time. So, like, also just for those people that wouldn't know, I think everyone in this audience probably does, but it stands for Building Automation and Control Systems. But to me, funny thing there, and then that's maybe you can give some context on that one, Remy, as well. It's a bit linked with this one. But in the end, like, the piece of legislation, BACS, fits in, like, there's three main directives or pieces of larger legislation, if you can call it like that. You have the Directive of Energy Performance and Building Directive. You've got the Energy Efficiency Directive in general, ED. It's more focused on really big consumers, whether it's buildings or industrial players or whatever. So linked with the ISO 2001 one, and then ETS, which is emission trading. But BACS is kind of actually focusing quite heavily, to an extent, on indoor climate, but a really big part is on energy efficiency in the end. But it's part of a controls-oriented piece of legislation. So how did that come into place?
So basically, you have different sort of visions on how to drive the transition from the EU level, and the different pieces of legislation cover the sort of different visions. They're really like people that think you can drive everything through market signals and prices, and this is a bit the ETS2 coming in. So it's the carbon market at EU level, and now it's going to be extended from 2028 to buildings. And so anyone consuming fossil fuels in their buildings will be impacted and will see a gradual increase in their bills because of the market. So it's an incentive to consume less and switch to decarbonized energy solutions. And there you have the more sectoral legislation, with the ED being the sort of economy-wide measures that focus on energy efficiency, where you have specific measures on energy audits and energy management systems, and the more specific one on buildings, where you have a few provisions in there that are really driving renovations and BACS in particular. So the first one being minimum energy performance standards that have been adopted for the non-residential buildings. So there, member states will have to make sure that the 16% and then 26% worst performing buildings will be improved in the coming years. So you have two deadlines, 2030 and 2033. So basically, we'll have to renovate a quarter of the non-residential buildings, or at least improve their energy performance in the next few years. It's a huge endeavor, but we also see that there are information tools, EPCs, as I was mentioning, quite well understood now, and the BACS requirement that we're going to mention a bit later.
Yeah, but in the end, I think what's important is like it's all different regulations. Like with EPC, it's very certificate driven, but even there, for example, in Belgium, you've got for the non-residential the obligation to measure. So it's not only dependent on like, do you have X amount of isolation with your actual consumption levels, but ETS2 will also be influenced by that. Like, what part is firing or something? But so it becomes, the interplay becomes important. It's not just important to comply with one or the other anymore.
Indeed. I think there's some that are meant to be signals, and by signals, not just information, is monetary signals pushing you to change your behavior. EPC in itself, it's an information tool, but we're seeing that because it's simple to understand-ish, we're seeing that governments are using it, like in Flanders, for example, or in France, you have the same system for the rental market for residential buildings, where you base the renovation requirements on the EPCs. And so progressively, it's likely to see more and more in Europe that the F and G buildings first will need to improve their performance by a given date.
Maybe a bit of I don't know to what extent you can answer that, then we can jump to the next, but like there's a lot of legislations here, and some have been like really will be enforced soon and are 100% sure. Like in theory, all of these are sure, but some others might be debated to an extent. Like you don't have a crystal ball, of course, you can't exactly predict the future, but maybe you have some visibility on which ones are like very high likelihood to be 100% sure, and where might still changes occur in the next year or two.
Yeah, I mean, there's a simplification push at the EU level. So there's this idea that we have to make the legislation easier to apply for businesses in Europe, but also lower the reporting requirements on the member states. That being said, we're seeing a sort of cautiousness now. Businesses have really voiced the fact that stability is very important to be able to plan investments and to engage in any type of works. And yeah, so there, what we know is the intention of the Commission is to keep things as they are in terms of the ambition up to 2030. now next from the end of this year onwards, we'll debate what's going to happen between 2030 and 2040. But very clearly, ETS2 heavily debated, but now set for 2028 as a starting date. EPBD implementation deadline is at the end of May this year, and provisions of BACS are not really contested. So this is something that we expect, even if there's debate in the coming years, is something that's likely to stay. So there's a sort of certainty. It's not really a sort of controversial point.
Oh, good to know. Good to know. Just a side note for the audience, we did a separate webinar earlier this month on EED and obligations there. So if you have questions on whether you are a company that has to comply with that, feel free to take a look at. You can subscribe to get the recording of that if you go to the website. But today is on BACS. So maybe we have to go fast a little bit on this part to have enough time for the rest. But I do think that the deadlines are pretty important, and then we can maybe jump to the concrete implementation in Europe.
Sure. So very quickly, I mean, this you can find, it's really in the directive. So basically, you have a deadline that's already passed, and on non-residential buildings, you have HVAC above 290 kilowatts. You have to have a BACS by 2025. It's increasing the scope to BACS above 70 kilowatts by 2030. So it's a good signal for all the...
This is the power, right? This is not your actual consumption. This is the
nominal rated power. Exactly.
Exactly. So the max power in the end, the rating power of the installation.
Indeed.
That's an important one, because a lot of those are only from time to time actual running on those powers, and a lot of time well under, if they're well managed at least. So that's an important component. Know that, yeah, so it's by 2025, but in some countries the implementation deadline, or when fines start running, is in 2026. It depends a bit on the country, but in any case, pretty soon.
Indeed. And there's, I mean, for new buildings and buildings undergoing major renovation in the residential sector, there's similar requirements for BACS that will be applying from the end of May this year. So it's coming very soon, and I mean, yeah, it's basically tomorrow.
Indeed. Okay, let's go to the next. Yeah, so this pretty much we explained this, like EPBD is the legal basis on the EU level, and then the national, so it's a directive, which means it gives direction to all the countries on what they have to implement, and then the countries translate it to national legislation, right? That's what it means.
Indeed. So it's basically, the directive sets the EU objective, it's the general objective, and the means to achieve this objective are open for member states, and they come with their own ways to achieve the given objective, with, I mean, some level of sort of guidance and direction given by the Commission. And you've put in the slide the very important implementation guidelines that were produced by the Commission and released last year. It's something answering the questions that you might have to make sure that you're complying with the rationale, and that are meant for member states to develop those national legislation that translate the EU objective.
Yeah. No, good, cool. So also for reference, by the way, for those that wanted an interesting component, because there's two ways to approach it. Like, you can go bottom up, look at how each country implemented it specifically. And quite a few countries have already released, of course, their legislation, some early, we'll come back to that in the next slide, and some others are still implementing it very last minute, because it's this year it has to be in place, but that will be pushed in the next few months probably. But like for those where it's not clear yet, this one, you will receive the slides. The implementation guideline by the Commission is super relevant, but because it gives guidelines to how it should be implemented. So all national legislations will probably look a lot like this. At the same time, we did do a deep dive in quite a few countries, so some of that information will come in the next couple. So just timeline-wise, somewhere early, France, Germany, and the Nordics, where the compliance deadline is already passed. Of course, penalties might not always be in place yet. Then Flanders and Belgium is today. Brussels and Wallonia is in theory in 2025, but actually the publication is later. So it will actually be enforced in end of 26. And then Netherlands is 2026. Now EU-wide, the EPBD target, maybe Remy, it's 2030, but this is for the lower thresholds, right?
Yeah, exactly. Normally, the larger threshold of 290 kilowatts should already be implemented. Obviously, sometimes there's a bit of delay, but it means that member states could be attacked on the non-implementation of the measure.
So they will get fined if they don't do something soon.
Indeed.
So what this next section is going to be about is like, so what's the common reality, and why do we do this webinar? Is pretty much we've had the question from quite a few customers like, hey, what solution can I put in place if I want to be compliant with one solution across my countries where I operate? Because you can be compliant in one country, but then not in another, and you don't want to manage 50 different solutions because that's completely unscalable. So that's why we dove into this topic, and that's what we're going to focus on. As a case study, we're just going to give an example of France because they were one of the early publishers of it. So maybe Remy, you know this one really well.
Yeah. I mean, we received so we had actually the person in charge of implementation in the ministry going to us to explain a bit what they're doing in France at the moment, and you're seeing that very clearly they're sort of mirroring what's required in the directive at the national level. They started a bit early with the so-called décret tertiaire, which is a piece of legislation that's a bit broader than just BACS and mandates the progressive reduction of energy consumption in large buildings. They're expected to extend this to smaller buildings, also to comply with the EPBD. And you have both the BACS requirements and the obligations regarding inspections that are in there. And what's interesting is that they have a bit of return on experience on the enforcement, and you see on their data that basically there's a really good uptake of BACS in buildings that are extremely large, but there's still a really wide margin for progress and adoption in non-residential buildings that are a bit smaller. So there, I mean, the potential for savings is really huge still. So it's great to see that the measures are starting to be implemented, and there are opportunities that are opening for the different companies in this space.
Okay, cool. Okay, they're going to jump into what it actually means implementation in a bit. Quick, I did see Philippe de Klerk asked a quick question about the exception concerning hydraulically coupled. So that's a very Belgium specific and actually indeed Flanders specific exception in the end that doesn't apply to most countries. That then here, just so for information, we're referring to this here. So that the cutoff points from where it's obligatory, the 290 kilowatts of nominal power or 70 kilowatts in 2030. So in Flanders, it's when it's hydraulically coupled. In most countries, it's just in general, the combination of heating, cooling, ventilation, and so the total of that, whether it's hydraulically coupled or not. Walloon region in Belgium will probably copy that, but it's not 100% certainty, and Brussels is debating whether they will copy that or be more strict. So it's not a certainty that exception will apply in Wallonia and Brussels, especially Brussels, based on the info we got. I hope that helps. So from there, maybe like what are the similarities actually? Because I think that's pretty interesting to know. Like, so the idea is like actually what BACS is about is energy efficiency but in running a building. So it's not like the certificates, which is a bit more theoretical efficiency. This is like actual operational efficiency. How well is it running? So, and part of that, yes, isolation levels will have an impact, but also like how's your HVAC actually running? How's your building being used? So it's a lot of the requirements are actually energy requirements, not all of them. There is a minimum level of automation that has to be in place. And then there is like a set of measurements that has to be in place, mix of energy consumption measurements, but also indoor quality measurements, communication between the energy management features and what's on the controls level and optimization possibilities. Analysis is key, and then also controls. That controls are in place one way or another. So measuring, benchmarking things, comparing data, setting alerts, and actually tracking and following up on those or core functionalities. We did put in a bit of information on like what's obligatory to measure on electricity, natural gas, other fuels, and heating. Actually, in the first webinar we hosted on BACS, it's also, you can find it online, you get a more detailed breakdown of what type of meters are obliged. Like what certified meters that have certain homologation in place, so they are considered compliant. So you can find that there. But typically it means digital meters every 15 minutes and live performance indication that can be tracked. It doesn't always have to be real-time optimization, but that you get near real-time data out of the systems in most countries. Communication-wise, it must enable communication with the technical building systems with central supervision and optimization suggestions, and analyze the energy consumption and suggestions to adjust. So it means like one alert per energy meter, for example. This is what is in place in Belgium. I will go over this a little bit fast, but the idea is you need consumption measuring, you need control systems in place, and you need a feedback loop to see where does anything goes wrong. To then can be a maintenance task that has to be dispatched to change things, or set point suggestions to change something on the level of controls, so that there is communication between those systems in place. You can go quite deep in this, but then we need some more time. But Remy, is there anything key that we should really talk about here?
I mean, you summarized it very well. The sort of list of capacities or abilities that your BACS need to have to do are listed by the Commission quite well in terms of its monitoring, analyzing, benchmarking energy efficiency, detecting losses, informing, communication, and interoperability. And there, I mean, there's a point of, and it'd be interesting to know how do you ensure the slice point interoperability is becoming more and more of a key question once you have a system that's getting more and more complex, with potentially adding with the electric vehicles, like a lot of different technical building systems to integrate. So how do you go about it?
Yeah, good question. More near the end, we have a bit of a high level view, because this is a topic where we can dive a lot deeper, of course, but then we can talk in a few hours on only that. But I think key is that in every building or asset, maybe we can jump to next one. So like this is very schematic view of a building, like with controllers and thermostats, and then charging equipment, and a lot of things happening, and linked to a central BMS that links with all the controllers, and then an EMS that's connected with a set of gateways to everything. Thing is that reality is that half of the time, half of these things are not connected. Some things are semi-connected, and like this is the building base that's in place most of the time, right? There is some automation, but scattered and not centralized all the time. So you have to like start from a non-ideal situation where a ton of information is, you have to be able to connect in a way with different hardware suppliers, with different protocols, different APIs, to make sure you connect everything. And if you just make sure your data quality is good and your interconnectivity is really good, then you can build on that in the future. because new things will be added, EVs will be added, chargers will be added, things will be added over time. It's just a matter of creating really good data infrastructure in a way, if that makes sense. And that has been lacking historically in the built environment, I would say. It's still a little bit of a lagging sector on the, on the data side, especially in the maturity of it. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Remy.
Yeah,
or...
no, definitely. And I fully agree with your last comment. I mean, it's sort of both at the micro and macro level where we see that data has been lacking, or let's say has not been collected as much as it should and organized as much as it should over the past few years. The EPBD is starting to try to sort of address this, but this is a bit the start of this, and there's really a lot of work that's needed there.
Yeah, yeah, it's a bit linked with this one. Like in the end, if you want to go to BACS compliance, you need to first know like what's your asset portfolio, your gap analysis of like what is actually lacking, and find the right approach. Because I think it's a bit linked with this. It's not like zero or completely black or white. It's not like you don't have anything or you have a certain vendor of a BMS system, the flagship model implemented. There is combinations of like building management systems, energy management, more simple controls plus intelligent analysis on top, but that is linking with it. There's different ways of approaching it, but there's, yeah, some can make sense on an individual building level, but then there's also the question, how do you manage a portfolio of assets? Because then even though if you have a good solution for one building, if you have 50 buildings to manage, if it's 50 different systems, you also have a big issue. Is that something like also from your experience, Remy, to what extent is that talked about? Like, how do you manage this on portfolios of assets? Or is that not really a conscious topic yet?
So, I mean, the way, I mean, we approach buildings it often from the very, very macro perspective of the EU legislation. And there's indeed, and we were discussing that yesterday, actually, like the need for a better sort of feedback loop between the people actually working in the fields and the ones designing the legislation. So they're indeed understanding a bit better the reality of the ones who operate the buildings and the one who provide the solutions is something that's key when designing the legislation. We're seeing that especially now, it's a sort of arguments where saying that there's a need for well, legislation that's comparable or that's easier to implement across borders. It's something that resonates quite well, and that the message that we're trying to push. But sometimes, especially at this time now, where we're in the implementation stage, member states are going their own ways, and we're operating at the EU level. At the national level, it's often actors a bit like us, but also directly companies that have to have the sort of interactions with the decision makers. And it'd be interesting to know to what extent you're having this sort of discussions when you're working with the national level and the setup of this national requirements for BACS, for example.
So if I can frame that question, like how do those with companies, for example, or portfolio owners, how that actually goes when we're talking it's on a country level? Well, they're trying to figure it out themselves as well, right? It's most of the time we're actually helping them out with understanding the legislation. Because for us we did quite a deep dive in this already. So it's a lot of technical back and forth with specialists and with especially those people that implement the legislation locally, because that's they know what's coming or what's already been published and how it will then also be checked, because sometimes the legislation is published, but the question is how will penalties be applied 8 or 10 months down the line. So it's about like understanding how can you technologically solve it in the same way, even though the official publication of the legislation is slightly different. Like what's behind it and how can we find a common thread in a way? It's maybe a bit fake as an answer, but yeah, but for us, I guess what the main goal is, and I don't think there's a slide behind this, but in most countries, like you have a bunch of norms behind this. In Belgium, there's a very specific implementation, especially in Flanders. But you have an ISO norm, and you also have, I think, we have them in the beginning, the reference to the norms. Which, yeah, look for the, we'll share that afterwards, a specific slide on this one. But in the end, for example, if you want to follow the EN norm, like you have, most countries are obliging Class B, but actually, if you want to be Class A compliant, and so being future-proof for 2028, 2030 probably, then you also want to already have certain features in place to be like certain that you stay compliant in the future. So we try to see like how can we fix that by integrating with the right hardware vendors and all of these things to really create an open ecosystem where the right suppliers can click in and that we have a really future-proof solution. Very briefly, maybe here we can touch on this so we can actually focus here. For us, like what we see or where we could potentially play a role, that's obviously up to the audience if they find that interesting or not. But so BACS is an obligation on buildings. And if you're above a certain nominal power threshold, you have to comply. The thing is, that's just on a building level. So if you have a portfolio of buildings to manage, especially across different countries, you really don't want a completely different system to manage each individual building to make it BACS compliant, because then, yeah, most of those in the end functionalities is how do I optimize the energy performance through my controls? Because that's what is behind it. So you ideally really have both on your BACS compliant buildings, but as well as other non-BACS compliant buildings where, for example, EPC, NR, non-residential is applicable, or other legislations are applicable. You want to manage them in the same way, so it becomes scalable. So this is where we really focus on, like building a scalable system on top of different building management systems or control systems. Doesn't really have like sometimes a full BMS system, sometimes not. Yeah, just put a sneak peek of what the platform looks like. I don't want to focus too much on NRC itself here, but what it can look like if you have one system to manage your different buildings from that perspective. But it's really just a quick sneak peek. It's an example of an optimization suggestion, for example, that it comes out of that, how you can change your controls, but also anomalies that are automatically detected just using AI models, in this case on a ventilation unit. That's it. So I think that's enough about us, just a sneak peek to what it could look like across a large portfolio of buildings. Yeah, this is actually what I earlier referred to. So we have a bunch of connectors in the end. So we kind of try to build one ecosystem of all of that, like different building management systems, different metering gateways, IoT systems, and classic energy monitoring tools, let's put it that way. So how can we pull them all together in one system that standardizes and cleans those data? So you know you've got good data that actually analyze that with the AI layer. But if anyone wants to know more about that, feel free to contact us. I don't want to go too deep into what NRC does today. But maybe we can then now take the remaining time to actually dive into some Q&As. So if anyone has any pressing question, please push them now into the chat or the Q&A. This is the moment. You will get these slides, and here you can find specific information on what is BACS and the revised EPBD. Is there anything I missed so far, Remy, before we go to Q&A?
I mean, just to react to one point that you were mentioning, saying that sometimes it's actually good to go beyond just compliance with the legislation. Having a sort of long-term perspective is not only good business, so making sure that you do the most and save the most energy and most money. It's that we know what the endpoint is, and basically it's going to be net zero buildings. So already sort of making sure that you have the highest standards will make your building, your portfolio future-proof. So you don't have to go at it 2, 3, 4 times. Like you do it once, and you're all set for the future. So indeed, I think that's a key element to mention, because it can save a lot of time.
Absolutely. No, true. It's like if you just do the bare minimum to comply, you're shooting yourself in the foot. It's because like every time you do that, you're missing out of a ton of savings, simply cost, but also like one of the worst things you can do is then buy the cheapest hardware, for example, with the cheapest data solution on it, and then not necessarily about price, but then you're locked in with something. Then the next requirement comes and you can't sync it, and then you're buying yourself problems in a way. Maybe let's go into the Q&A. A really good point. What do we have of questions? If whatever you have in questions about BACS is really good as a question. So we have one question: if my company operates the HVAC systems within the shopping malls, and the HVAC are above the thresholds, do I understand that right? This is a question from, I can't see the full name, unfortunately, for some reason. I think your surname is Kamath. So you're operating HVAC systems that are above the threshold. Is that the question? And are you then obliged to still do it? I don't fully understand the exact question. Can you maybe repeat it? Maybe you can see it, Remy.
Yeah, I think it'd be nice if Pierre-Pavel could reformulate a bit the question. Not sure I fully get it, but happy to follow up on this if you can precise a bit what you mean by this. Just maybe in the meantime, I see there's a question on the interpretation of where technically and economically feasible. So I mean, just for a note of background, there's a lot of mentions of where technically and economically feasible in the directive. This is mainly coming from conservatives who want to limit basically often the ambition of the directive, or at least make sure that there's a sort of cost optimality perspective adopted when things are implemented. The correct interpretation is in the European Commission guidelines. I don't have like the full sort of rational and elements in mind just now, but you'll find that in the guidelines. It starts around page 243. If you want to read, it's a very big document covering all the articles of the EPBD, but you have guidelines for member states to interpret that. And so basically, member states have to sort of justify if they make exemptions based on this criteria.
And that is how so that section specifically explains like what the exceptions are for technical and economical feasibility.
So it's what it's on what grounds can you create exemptions, basically. So you cannot, it's basically limiting the member states' interpretation of this, because you can definitely imagine that someone who doesn't want to really do much will use that and say, well, basically, this is too complicated or this is too expensive. And so there it's a sort of guidance to make sure that the interpretation of this is really based on actual facts that are acceptable as saying this is not technologically feasible or economically feasible.
On the very specific question here, like based on your background, would you say it's aligned with the intent, this exception, or not necessarily?
I mean, in the way that it's put in place and it's used, then yeah, the actual exemptions are quite limited usually. So I mean, member states make use of this type of wording, but they're restricted in what they can do in the implementation.
Okay, so like just for everyone, maybe the people that didn't really get the question, so this was the response to the question of the EU level interpretation of where technically and economically feasible. So in the BACS, as Remy explained, like that's one stated quite a few times. But so the question was like the exemption in Flanders on buildings that only have only one of the three systems. That there it doesn't apply. That is that is an exemption that can be made. But the logic, by the way, on the Flemish level behind that is that you need to be able to have energy destruction. So ventilation can pull heating out of the building, or air conditioning can work against heating. That's why they put it like that. Bertan Pakaridzi, I hope I pronounced your name well. Otherwise, my apologies. So your question was, does BACS allow for manual optimization, meaning that if there's no BMS in the building, how can NRC help with it, given that we only have smart metering data? I'm going to give it the answer from my perspective. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Remy. But so you do need some level of controls in place to make it compliant, and then you need to be able to have full energy data, and then from that suggest optimizations. That suggestion, like there's no direct obligation to have a real-time feedback loop with model predictive control, for example. So if you do have controls or thermostats and certain levels of central controls, not a full BMS in place, and you have smart metering, then you can combine those with an intelligent system to optimize your controls with regular frequency, but not necessarily live. But if you don't have controls in place, so it's the completely manual old school system, then not. So the answer is not, you do need a full BMS system, but also you do need a level of controls in place plus intelligence to be able to comply, if that makes sense. Maybe you have something to add to that one, Remy?
I mean, the obligations, at least in the directive, are really based on this kilowatt threshold. Is basically if your building is above this threshold, you have to have the system that has the sort of basic functions that we mentioned during the webinar, and it doesn't go a bit beyond that. It's sort of no more, no less than this.
Yeah, indeed. But so long story short, if you only have smart meters but no controls, then no. There is in between solutions between fully fledged, fully developed BMS and nothing that can comply. So it depends on your building. Sometimes a full-fledged BMS is the right solution. For certain buildings, it totally makes sense. So it depends on which building. But feel free to ask some more questions later on that. I'm going to jump to the other one. The penalties for non-compliance. That depends on the country as well, right?
Exactly. I mean, this is designed. That's what we were mentioning basically in the beginning, where the directive sets the objective, but the means to achieve them are left to the member states. And so you don't, like, the directive doesn't say whether you need to have penalties or whatever the system of enforcement in place is. It's the way some countries will probably approach this, but the level of the penalties And whether there's penalties or not will really depend on how national governments decide to implement the directive.
Exactly. We can, like, once again there, if like for Belgium, for example, we had them laid out in the previous webinar, the exact penalties, but it's also a broad range depending on the size of your buildings and the level of non-compliance. So I should quickly look them up. So yeah, between 500 and 200,000 euros, and it can be per building. In Flanders, for example. So it can go really big, but that really depends. It's a very broad range. Thanks for clarifying your question. So the shopping malls will be obliged to be compliant with BACS in Europe. Huh? So what about the retail company that occupies large spaces in such shopping malls? Like, is that retail company obliged to be compliant as well? And then the energy savings will be generated at least 15% year over year, but that's a independent one, I guess. But maybe Remy, do you have a good answer there? Like, so it's the building that has to comply, right? So it depends on, it's mostly the owner that has to make sure it is compliant, right? So there, it depends on the ownership. So if the retail company is the tenant, they should force the owner to comply. What technology do we collect the energy information to analyze it later? A whole bunch of different connectivity options. It's from MQTT connectors over native connectors to a bunch of systems. There's hardware partners with different ones we can integrate with. Which is just to take a look at the NRC Connect page on the website. It gives an overview of the different connectivity options. Would love to go deeper into that, but that would be a topic on its own. Hope that helps. We can put a link into chat maybe to that page. Then another question, how the air quality should be interpreted in the EPBD, and recommendations in the EPBD transposition, measurement of ppm 2.5 and ppm 10. Are they included? Yeah. So maybe we can go into that.
Sure. So looking, so basically the EPBD defines the indoor environmental quality as the results of an assessment of conditions inside the building that influence health and well-being based on parameters such as temperature, humidity, ventilation rate, and presence of contaminants. So this is a sort of broad baseline that's given by the directive. This needs to be assessed by BACS from, I think it's the implementation deadline onwards. Regarding the sort of more precise way to look into the specifics of the various parameters of IQ, again, I'll refer you to the guidance of the Commission that dives a bit deeper into what standards to use, basically, and what parameters are actually falling into this.
Yeah, so there, I think, just quickly referring back to the slides, you will find the link to those specific directives for implementation on slide 9. You will receive the deck afterwards with a follow-up mail on the webinar. So there you can find these guidelines. Good. Do you have some other questions in the audience? Or is that it? We are almost at time, so from that perspective. Yes, Steph, you had a question. If heating capacity exceeds 290 kilowatts, hydraulically coupled, but cooling is provided only by a few standalone units, is the building in scope only for heating? That's a question specifically on the Flemish-Belgian setup, I suppose. So as far as I understood, So that this is, of course, like if it's only split units standalone, if it exceeds it, the 290, so the heating on its own, and you have ventilation and cooling going on, as far as I know, you do have to comply because you do have ventilation and cooling together with your heating, and your hydraulic coupled total is still over 290 because just one of your systems is already over 290. So in that case, you do have to. But indeed, like if the total of your systems is 290, but hydraulically coupled doesn't end up at 290, then not. So that's the nuance between the two. I hope that was a clear answer. Maybe you have to add something to that, Remy, or
I think that was quite clear.
so this one could be a good one, the one that Helen is pushing in the chat. We're hosting an in-person event, an energy expert meetup in our offices. That one will be in Antwerp on the 31st of March at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So if you have any personal questions or would like to chat personally on some of these topics, feel free to join then. Mark it in your calendar already. You can subscribe on the website. Indeed, Jan Paul, so you have to sum up the kilowatt hours of all devices. In most European countries, yes, but Steph's question was specifically referring to an exception case in one country, being in the Flemish region of Belgium, where you only have to sum up the hydraulically coupled ones. So that's a nuance there. Will the requirements for compliance with BACS get stricter, or just who has to be compliant? Question from Michiel Soenen. Maybe you can answer this one, Remy?
So, I mean, I can only speak for what's in the text. As we've seen, there's going to be a lowering of the threshold to 70 kilowatts planned for 2030. So that's for sure. I can't say whether the number of things that BACS system will have to do in the future will change, or how things could get stricter. I mean, the sort of general trend
and more essence.
Yeah, I think in general there's a tendency to sort of spread the technology because it's something where we see results, and there, I mean, the policymakers tend to sort of start from one baseline and extend it progressively. But the next real sort of increase of the requirement will be for 2030.
And then you have the lighting related one for 2028, right? In
yes.
some countries. So that becomes more strict.
So it's 28 for and there's also the same sort of split between like the high rated power and low one with the extension 2030.
Yeah. Good. We're at time at the moment, so we'll start rounding off unless there is a really important question on anyone's tongue at the moment. But thanks a lot for the attendance and for the good questions as well. And Remy, thanks a lot for joining us today. It was really interesting to see a bit of the European broader perspective as well. So thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks. It was a good discussion.
Bye everyone. Hope to see you soon.
Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye.